Let's move on to the fourth story. About the brothers who had their inheritance taken by their aunt for years without even knowing it. What happens when the person who promised to protect you is the one who took everything from you? What would you do if one day you discovered that you had been deceived and used from the very beginning? My younger brother and I faced a bitter truth. The only person we trusted turned out to be a traitor. Upon learning the truth, I decided to expose everything, even if it meant going against the one who raised us. Listen to our story and tell us, did we do the right thing? Hello everyone. My name is Ryan. I'm 30 years old and working for a large corporation with an annual salary of $200,000 th. My younger brother, Jake, 27, is a skilled IT professional with a stable income. Our lives may seem perfect, but few know that we once lost everything. 18 years ago, our family was happy. Our parents weren't wealthy, but they did everything possible to give us a warm and loving childhood. Then tragedy struck. Our father passed away in a car accident. From that moment on, our mother became our only support, carrying the weight of everything on her shoulders. She worked day and night, trying to raise us while paying off mounting debts. But life is never fair. 3 years later, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. At that time, our family's only asset was a small house. To afford her treatment and settle debts, we had no choice but to sell it at a low price to a relative. It broke our hearts, but we had no other option. When I was 15 and Jake was just 12, our mother passed away, leaving the two of us alone in the world with nowhere else to go. Our grandfather took us in. He wasn't wealthy or held any high status, but he did everything he could to give us a home. He was the reason we became who we are today. But there was one Ruth we didn't know back then. A secret buried for years until I uncovered it myself. We lived with our grandfather for 2 years before he too passed away due to old age. For the third time in our lives, Jake and I lost the only family we had left. We thought we would have to fend for ourselves, but after the funeral, Aunt Linda, our father's younger sister, approached us and said she would take us in. Living at Aunt Linda's house felt unfamiliar at first. The house was much larger than our grandfather's. Well, mine is furnished in an affluent neighborhood. She wasn't hot toward us, but didn't mistreat us either. We had food on the table, our rooms, and at the very least, a roof over our heads. However, the person who truly made us feel welcome was Uncle Mark, Aunt Linda's husband. He was a quiet, calm, and genuine man. In those early days when Jake and I felt lost, he was the one who reached out to us, making sure we didn't feel so alone. He took us shopping for personal items, asked about our school, and even taught Jake how to play basketball in the backyard. Uncle Mark wasn't a man of many words, but his small, thoughtful actions spoke volumes. Not everyone in the house welcomed us that way. Madison, Aunt Linda's only daughter, never hid her resentment toward us. She was my age, raised in comfort, and had never known hardship. From the moment we set foot in the house, her eyes were filled with disdain. "Why are they here?" I still remember her asking Aunt Linda at our very first dinner. "Don't you already have enough to deal with?" From her tone to her expression, it was clear. She saw us as nothing more than a burden. Whenever Jake or I walked past her, she would contemptuously glare at us. The sarcastic remarks, the cold stares, the time she would conveniently forget to leave food for us. Madison made sure we felt like intruders in the house we were forced to call home. And, while Aunt Linda never openly expressed it, I could feel it. She never saw us as her own. She took us in, but there was never any real love. A year later, when I turned 18, I graduated with pretty good grades. It should have been a memorable milestone. A new beginning as I stepped into college and built my future. But things weren't that simple. I still remember that dinner clearly. The whole family sat around the table, and as always, Jake and I tried to stay quiet to avoid irritating Madison. Everything seemed normal until Aunt Linda set her fork on her plate and looked up at me. "Ryan," she began, her voice calm but distant, "now that you graduated, I think it's time for you to start caring for yourself." I put my chopsticks down, sensing something was off. "What do you mean?" Aunt Linda sighed. "Your uncle and I have done our best to raise you and Jake, but we can't afford to pay for your college. You should find a part-time job to support yourself if you want to go." The air in the room grew heavy. I glanced at Uncle Mark. His brows furrowed, clearly disagreeing with Aunt Linda's words. "Linda, that's not his responsibility," Uncle Mark said. "Ryan is the smart kid. He deserves to go to college without having to worry about money." Madison suddenly put her knife down and crossed her arms. "Dad, Mom's right. Our family isn't responsible for taking care of them forever. real enough to take care of himself. I clenched my fists under the table, feeling every word from Madison like a knife to the chest. She had never considered me part of the family. Now, that was clearer than ever. Jake looked at me with concern, but I gave him a slight nod to reassure him. I knew I had no other choice. "All right," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'll take care of myself." And from that day on, my life changed completely. I juggled school and multiple part-time jobs to support myself. I did everything: waiting tables, working in warehouses, and selling in retail stores. Sleepless nights, rushed meals, moments of exhaustion, or collapsed at my desk. I paid the price to secure my future. As for Aunt Linda, she never once asked if I was okay. When Jake turned 18, he received the best news of his life 3 years later. He had been accepted into a prestigious technology university. It was his dream, the goal he had worked tirelessly toward for years. I remember that day clearly. Jake held the acceptance letter, his eyes shining with excitement and pride. But that joy didn't last long because we both knew what was coming. And just as expected, during dinner that evening, Aunt Linda made the same offer she had given me 3 years earlier. "Jake, congratulations on getting into college," she said with a fake smile. "But you know I can't afford your tuition. If you want to go, you must earn your own money." Jake wasn't surprised. He looked at me, then turned back to Aunt Linda and nodded. "Of course, I understand." I caught the slight smirk on Madison's lips, as if she was enjoying the moment. Jake and I had long understood we were just guests in this house. The fact that we had been given shelter until we turned 18 was already considered a privilege. We had no right to expect anything more. After dinner, I pulled Jake outside to the backyard, where we always went when we needed to talk privately. "You okay?" I asked, but I knew it was just a mask for exhaustion. "I'm fine. I'll work while I study, just like you did." I patted his shoulder. I knew he would make it because we had no other choice. After graduating with honors, I was fortunate to land a job at a major corporation with a yearly starting salary of $80,000 TH. It was a dream number for a fresh graduate, and it gave Jake and me the opportunity we had been waiting for. Leaving Aunt Linda's house and becoming independent. We rented a small but cozy apartment in the suburbs. For the first time in years, we had a space that was ours. No more contemptuous looks from Madison or passive-aggressive remarks from Aunt Linda. Life alone wasn't necessarily easy, but at least it belonged to us. Still, I couldn't completely sever ties with the past. Even though I knew Aunt Linda had never considered us family, I still appreciated the years she had taken us in, even if only a name. So every month, I set aside $1,500 and sent it to her family as a gesture of gratitude. Uncle Mark disagreed with it. "Ryan, you don't owe us anything," he told me once when I visited. "I took you boys in because it was the right thing to do, not because I expected anything in return." But Aunt Linda was different. She never refused. No thank you, no questions. She silently accepted the money. You might wonder, why didn't we return to our grandfather's house? The answer is simple. We never had a choice. After Grandpa passed away, I was only 17 and Jake was just 14. We were too young to own property or manage any assets he left behind. That meant all decisions fell into the hands of Aunt Linda, our only legal guardian. At first, we assumed the house was still there waiting for us. But 2 years later, Aunt Linda casually informed us that it had been sold. There was no one living there, and leaving it empty would only deteriorate it, she said at dinner, her tone indifferent as if it were just a minor decision. "I thought it was best to sell it and use the money for your future." At that time, I was 19 and Jake was 16. We were too young to understand the complexities of legal matters. We trusted her. No one told us that Grandpa had left a will. No one told us that the house belonged to us. 4 years later, Jake graduated with honors and quickly secured a job with a yearly starting salary of $120,000 TH. Our lives had finally stabilized. After years of struggling with rent, we decided to own a place that genuinely belonged to us. We found a cozy home in the suburbs, a place we could finally call home in every sense of the word. No more moving from place to place. No more feeling like unwanted guests. This resulted from our hard work. We wanted to share this joy with everyone. We hosted a small housewarming party, inviting some friends, colleagues, and even Aunt Linda's family to celebrate with us. Uncle Mark was the same as always. Kind, cheerful, and genuinely proud of us. Madison didn't come. Maybe she no longer cared about us. And Aunt Linda, she wore her usual smile, saying all the right congratulatory words. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't pleased about our success. The party went smoothly. People ate, laughed, and toasted the life Jake and I had built. As the night wound down and guests started leaving, Aunt Linda stayed behind. Uncle Mark had left earlier, so in the end, it was just Jake, me, and her. "Ryan, Jake," she said softly, placing her hands on the table. "I have a favor to ask." Jake and I exchanged glances. A sense of unease crept over me. "I'm going through a bit of financial trouble," she continued, trying to sound casual. "I need a loan about $50,000, just for 2 months. I promise I'll pay it back in full." The air grew heavy. I looked at Jake and saw the hesitation in his eyes. "You both aren't the type to be overly calculating," Aunt Linda added, anticipating our reluctance. "I'll even put it in writing, an official loan agreement." "You have my word." A part of me wanted to refuse outright. Something in my gut told me this wasn't right. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore that, for better or worse, she had once taken us in. Whether or not her financial troubles were real, turning her down entirely made me feel guilty. Jake took a deep breath before turning to me. "What do you think?" With no other choice, I nodded and took the signed loan agreement from Aunt Linda's hands. I thought our lives had finally settled into peace until one day, exactly a year ago, I received a message from an unknown number. "Ryan, I need to meet with you about your grandfather. This is something I should have told you a long time ago." At first I assumed it was a prank or scam, but when I reached the signature at the end, my heart nearly stopped. "Attorney Richard Coleman." I immediately called back. Deep and slightly weary, the man on the other end asked to meet in person. He didn't want to discuss too much over the phone. That evening, Jake and I drove to the address he provided. A small house in the suburbs. When we stepped inside, we saw a man in his 60s. His hair almost gray and his face marked with guilt. "I'm Richard Coleman," he said. "I was your grandfather's attorney, and there's a truth you both should have known 12 years ago." He placed a stack of old documents on the table and slid them toward me. My heart pounded as I saw the original will, clearly signed and official. I flipped through the pages, my eyes widening as I read the contents. Our grandfather's house legally belonged to Jake and me. It had never been Aunt Linda's. A $300,000 trust fund had been divided into 2 parts. $100,000 was meant for Jake and me. $200,000 was allocated to Aunt Linda's family and Madison. I clenched my fists, struggling to stay calm. If this is the official will, why were we never told about it? Attorney Coleman exhaled heavily, guilt written all over his face. "Because Aunt Linda bribed me." After our grandfather passed away, he recounted how Aunt Linda met with him privately and offered a large sum of money to keep the will hidden. She took advantage of the fact that Jake and I were still minors, legally incapable of claiming our rightful inheritance. "I made a terrible mistake," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I stayed silent and allowed her to manipulate everything in her favor. The house was sold. She took it all from the trust fund that should have gone to you." Jake sat frozen, his hands clenched into fists. "So why are you telling us this now?" Attorney Coleman lowered his head. "I've lived with guilt for 12 years. Now that I'm retired, I can't take this secret to the grave. I know I can't fully undo what's been done, but at the very least, I can help you reclaim what's rightfully yours." I looked at Jake, neither spoke, but I knew we were thinking the same thing. Aunt Linda had deceived us for 12 years. And now it was time to bring the truth to light. We wasted no time. We took action immediately. The first step was cutting off the $3,000 monthly support we had been sending to Aunt Linda. For years I had convinced myself that this was a way to repay her for taking us in. But now with the truth exposed, I realized she had never truly cared about us. She had only seen us as a long-term investment. Next, we called Aunt Linda to demand the $50,000 loan she had borrowed from us. I dialed her number and put the call on speaker so Jake could hear. After just a ring, she picked up. "Ryan? Jake? Why are you calling so late? Is everything okay?" Her voice was as sweet as ever. I got straight to the point. "Do you remember the $50,000 loan you promised to repay in 2 months? It's been over 2 years now. We need it back." There was a brief silence on the other end before she let out a forced laugh. "Oh, that. I'm short on money, but I promise I'll pay it back soon. Just a little more time." Jake cut in, his voice colder than usual. "You guaranteed 2 months. It's been 2 years. We need that money now." This time Aunt Linda didn't bother hiding her irritation. What's wrong with you too? Is this how you treat the person who raised you? I took care of you for years. Before we could say anything else, she hung up. And just as I expected, when Aunt Linda didn't see the usual $3,000 deposit in her account precisely a week later, she called immediately. Ryan, Jake, I haven't received the money this month. Is everything okay? Her voice tried to sound calm, but I could hear the underlying panic. I motioned for Jake to stay quiet and replied in the most composed tone I could manage. Oh, we're saving up to throw you a birthday party. There was silence on the other end. My birthday. That's right. Don't worry. We want to give you an unforgettable celebration. To thank you for raising us all these years. Her voice wavered with suspicion. But my birthday doesn't have to be that extravagant. That's when Jake jumped in, adding a touch of fake excitement. Oh, don't worry, Aunt Linda, we've already booked a luxury restaurant. You should invite all the relatives. This will be huge. This time, she couldn't hide her excitement. Oh, my God. Are you two doing this for me? I'm so touched. Her voice practically squealed with joy. I could already picture her grinning, convinced that we had finally come to our senses. That this party was a sign of our gratitude. What she didn't know was that this wasn't just a birthday party. This was a public trial. I glanced at Jake, and we both knew that the actual game had just begun. 2 months later, the birthday party was held at an upscale restaurant in the city. We had put in a lot of effort to ensure this would be a night Aunt Linda would never forget. As we walked in, the room was filled with the lively chatter of relatives, laughter echoing throughout the space. In the center of the room, Aunt Linda stood out in an elegant dress, her face glowing with pride. The moment she spotted Jake and me, she rushed over, linking her arms with ours in an overly affectionate manner. Like we were the most devoted children in the world. Rian, Jake, you two are such wonderful boys. I knew it. I knew that one day you would realize everything I've done for you, she said, glancing around at the gathered relatives. Jake and I exchanged a look, but we kept our smiles intact. Let her enjoy this moment because soon, the real show was about to begin. Aunt Linda cleared her throat and turned to address the crowd. And then, as if she couldn't contain her self-minus satisfaction, she launched into her usual speech, the same tired story of her sacrifices. Family means everything, she began, her voice thick with emotion. I dedicated my life to raising these boys, caring for them when they lost their parents. I gave them all my love and strength to ensure they had a home, food, and a bright future. Some relatives nodded, and a few clapped politely. Others remained silent, probably because they had heard the song and danced too many times. As Aunt Linda continued to ramble on about her sacrifices, painting herself as the noble woman dedicated to raising 2 orphan boys, a voice suddenly rang out, cutting through her web of lies. You raised them using their inheritance in the house their grandfather left them, didn't you, Aunt Linda? The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward the entrance. Standing there was attorney Richard Coleman, holding a stack of documents. Someone quickly lowered the music, and the crowd's attention shifted to him. Aunt Linda's face went pale. Her fingers clenched tightly around her wine glass. What the heck is this? She muttered, her voice no longer carrying the same confidence. Attorney Coleman stood in the center of the room, his sharp gaze locked onto Aunt Linda. I was the lawyer who drafted Michael Carter's will. And today I'm here to correct my mistake. He pulled a document from his stack and held it up high for everyone to see. This is the legal last will of Michael Carter. According to this document, his house belonged to Ryan and Jake. Additionally, he left behind a trust fund worth $300,000, with $100,000 set aside specifically for them. A ripple of shock spread through the room. Some relatives' jaws dropped, while others began whispering amongst themselves. Attorney Coleman took a deep breath before turning to Aunt Linda. But this will was never made public. And the reason is, he paused as if carefully choosing his words. Finally, he sighed and admitted, because Aunt Linda bribed me to keep it hidden. The room fell into a tense silence. All eyes turned to Aunt Linda. Some filled with disbelief, others with disgust. She stood frozen for a few seconds. But then, just as quickly, she recovered her false composure. He's lying, she shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. Those two paid an old man to come here and slander me. Don't believe him, but Attorney Coleman wasn't about to let her twist the narrative. I have proof. He raised a bank statement for everyone. Clear evidence that Aunt Linda had transferred $50,000 into his account shortly after their grandfather's passing. Jake turned to me, a smirk playing on his lips. Sounds familiar. That number is quite the coincidence. I nodded and pulled out the promissory note Aunt Linda had signed just a few months ago for the same amount. I held it up. If you have nothing to hide, then explain this loan. Aunt Linda's hands trembled. Her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. You two are an ungrateful little brats. She screamed, slamming her fist onto the table. I raised you. I gave you a home. And this is how you repay me? The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some relatives shook their heads in disappointment. Others looked at her with nothing but contempt. Amidst the chaos, Uncle Mark remained seated, his expression unreadable. But as the truth unfolded, he could no longer stay silent. He abruptly stood up, his gaze fixed on Aunt Linda for a long, heavy moment. I've had my suspicions for years, but never imagined it could be this cruel. Without another word, he turned on his heels and walked away, completely ignoring Aunt Linda's weak, desperate calls after him. At that very moment, two police officers stepped into the restaurant. One of them pulled out an arrest warrant and read it aloud. Linda Carter, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and falsification of legal documents. We have sufficient evidence to take you into custody. Aunt Linda's face turned ghostly pale as she instinctively stepped back. No, this is a setup. They're framing me, she shrieked. But the officers didn't let her argue any further. They snapped the handcuffs onto her wrists right there in the middle of the party. Then, one of the officers turned to Attorney Coleman. Mr. Richard Coleman, you are also under arrest for aiding and abetting a criminal act. A collective gasp filled the room. Some relatives covered their mouths in shock. Others stood frozen, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Jake and I, however, remained silent. Everything was going exactly as planned. As Aunt Linda was escorted past me in handcuffs, she shot me a venomous glare, gritting her teeth as she hissed, I won't let you get away with this. I shrugged, my voice cold and unwavering. You don't have any chances left. And just like that, the woman who had deceived us for 12 years was finally exposed right in the middle of her party. The next day, as Jake and I were still processing the emotional aftermath of last night's chaotic party, Uncle Mark unexpectedly showed up at our doorstep. He no longer carried his usual calm demeanor. His silver hair was disheveled, and his deep, mean-eyed-set eyes were exhausted, as if he hadn't slept all night. We invited him in, but he remained standing, his hands clenched, his expression filled with undeniable pain. Ryan, Jake, he hesitated for a long moment before sighing. I know what Linda did was unforgivable, and I won't make excuses for her. But she's still my wife. Jake and I stayed silent, simply watching him. Uncle Mark swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. I don't expect you to forgive her, but if there's any way to give her a way out, I ask that you consider it. A pang tightened in my chest. Uncle Mark had been the only one in Linda's family who ever truly treated us well. And I knew this wasn't easy for him. He wasn't defending her actions, but after years of marriage, he couldn't cut off his emotions entirely. Jake spoke first. Do you know what she did to us? His voice wasn't filled with anger anymore, just disappointment. Uncle Mark nodded heavily. I do. I thought about it all night. And Madison, he paused, then shook his head. She disowned her mother. I froze. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. Madison had always stood by her mother's side. She had always treated us like an intrusion, a burden that didn't belong. But now, she had cut ties with her mother. She screamed at Linda right after leaving the party, Uncle Mark said, his voice low. Madison may be selfish. She may be spoiled. But she couldn't accept what her mother did to her nephews. Memories of Madison's taunts, glares, and disdainful smirks flashed through my mind. She wasn't inherently a lousy person. Her mother's influence had just blinded her. She told Linda straight to her face that she would never speak to her again. Uncle Mark sighed. I've never seen Madison this firm about anything before. Uncle Mark remained silent for a long moment before finally looking at us, his eyes filled with quiet desperation. I don't expect Linda to escape the consequences, he said softly. I only ask, is there any way she doesn't have to spend the rest of her life in prison? I sighed and glanced at Jake. We both knew that no matter how much Aunt Linda deserved punishment, Uncle Mark suffered the most. So now the question remained, what should we do? That night, Jake and I couldn't sleep. Everything should have been over, but Uncle Mark's pain, desperate expression lingered in my mind. He hadn't defended Aunt Linda's actions. He hadn't made excuses for her, but he had begged us to give her a way out. Not because she deserved it, but because after so many years together, he couldn't just stand by and watch his wife spend the rest of her life in prison. Jake let out a deep sigh, staring at the ceiling. What do you think? I answered quietly. I don't want to forgive her. Jake nodded. I feel the same way. He's the only one in that family who truly cared about us. If we push this all the way, he's the one who will hurt the most. We didn't say anything else after that. Just sighed simultaneously because deep down, we already knew. We had made our decision. I contacted the prosecutor handling Aunt Linda's case the next day and scheduled a face-minus-face meeting. Jake and I arrived at their office with a clear proposal. We don't want Aunt Linda to escape the consequences, but we're willing to request leniency on the condition that she pleads guilty and repays everything she stole. The prosecutor leaned back in their chair, studying us for a long moment before responding. Are you sure? Her sentence will significantly reduce if you don't push for further charges. I nodded. We understand. But most importantly, she takes responsibility for what she's done. After a few minutes of discussion, the prosecutor agreed to our request. Aunt Linda would be allowed to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, but she had to return everything she had stolen. As soon as we left the prosecutor's office, I sent a message to Uncle Mark. We requested leniency for Aunt Linda. She won't have to serve a long sentence if she pleads guilty and returns what she stole. But there's one condition: she can never be a part of our lives again. Less than a minute later, my phone vibrated. Uncle Mark was calling. Thank you, both of you, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. Even though I couldn't see him, I could imagine the relief in his voice, the weight finally lifting from his shoulders. Jake crossed his arms, watching me. Do you think we did the right thing? I took a deep breath, gazing out the window. It's not forgiveness. It's ending this in the way that makes the most sense to us. 2 weeks later, the trial officially began. Jake and I arrived early, not to watch Aunt Linda be punished, but to finally put an end to everything. She sat at the defendant's table beside attorney Richard Coleman, who was also being prosecuted for helping conceal the legal will. Uncle Mark was there too. He looked thinner, the stress weighing on him, but he still carried himself with the same quiet dignity. No matter how awful Aunt Linda had been, she had still been his wife for many years. The prosecutor laid out the entire case. Aunt Linda had hidden the will and stolen property that legally belonged to us. Attorney Richard Coleman had accepted a $50,000 bribe to remain silent. However, both had pleaded guilty and agreed to repay what they had taken, which allowed for a reduced sentence. Then, when the court moved to financial restitution, Uncle Mark suddenly stood up. I have sold my assets to repay Ryan and Jake for what was rightfully theirs. I froze, so did Jake. Uncle Mark had sold everything he owned to gather the $500,000 we were owed. For $100,000 from the sale of our grandfather's house, which Aunt Linda had stolen, $100,000 to restore the trust fund our grandfather had left for us. After Uncle Mark made his statement, the court asked for a decision regarding the money. I turned to Jake, and without a word, we both shook our heads. We will only accept the $400,000 from the house sale, but as for the $100,000, we refuse. Uncle Mark looked shocked, but that money was meant for you. Jake smiled. No, Uncle, that money belongs to you. We knew how much he had sacrificed to gather that sum, and the truth was he didn't know us anything. After considering the mitigating factors, the court delivered its verdict. Aunt Linda was sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation after her release. Attorney Richard Coleman received 1 year in prison, with 3 years of probation. Their punishment could have been far more severe, but their sentences were reduced because they admitted their guilt and returned the stolen assets. Aunt Linda had lost all her former pride. As the police led her away, she didn't look at us even once. Maybe at last, she had realized we had cut ties with her forever. After the trial, Uncle Mark came to see us. I don't even know how to thank you too, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I shook his hand. You don't have to. You're our real family. His eyes turned red as he nodded. Before leaving, he looked back at us one last time. If you ever need anything, I'll always be here. A few days later, the $400,000 was transferred into our account. Jake and I used part of it to buy a new home that truly belonged to us. The past was behind us. We were no longer the children who had been used and deceived. Now, we were free. This is where our story ends. But what would you have done if you were in our shoes? Did Jake and I make the right decision? Would you have forgiven or seen it through to the bitter end if you were in our place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.